Hello, everybody. My name is Oliver Laasch. I'm the author of the textbook Principles of Management, Practicing Ethics, Responsibility, Sustainability. And I believe that's the very book that you're using for your course at the moment at the University of New England, convened or led by your professor, Valerie Dalton. So thanks a lot, Valerie, for inviting me over to your class. And I'm very much looking forward because particularly this topic of forleading is an exciting one for me, because some people tell me, well, forleading, that's not really a word, is it? And my usual answer is, yeah, well, it could be one, couldn't it? Because we actually came up with that word, Alexandra Barrietta, who co-authored the chapter with me and I, in order to describe what happens in practice, which is that we're never really leaders, we're never really followers. Those practices in leading and following, they actually entangle, they come together. We cannot disentangle them and saying one is leading and the other one is forleading. So that's the practice of forleading, and we're going to have a close look at what that actually might mean if it was an actual word. So let's have a look at how that goes. Good. So what I find exciting about this topic is particularly situations like this. So this is the owner manager of this medium-sized company Allsafe in Germany, southern Germany. Very interesting manufacturing business in the automobile and aerospace engineering area. And you actually see, if you look at this, there seems to be somebody with a suit and somebody more in a kind of production facility, production worker type of outfit, but actually it looks like the roles are in a way inversed here, because usually what you would think the suit guy is the one who's explaining things and telling people what to do, but here it looks very much like it is the other way around. So the person working in production seems to explain to the one who's apparently somebody who's meant to be superior, if you want to think in hierarchical terms. And this company is actually very interesting. You will also see that if you look at our book, it is the introductory case. And the idea there is that at this company Allsafe, they do something that they call Augenhöhe in Germany, or Augenhöhe management. And Augenhöhe means eye level. So the idea is that there at any point in time, that eye level relationship can be and should be there between anybody being in that organization. So anybody at any point in time, because they are on eye level, can either be leading or following. And there's very, very few fixed assigned roles where one is most of the times a leader or most of the times a follower. So very, very interesting case. Have a close look at that if you're looking at the chapter once again. And that's a really good quote I really like a lot. Bosses are not necessarily good leaders. Subordinates are not necessarily effective followers. Many bosses couldn't lead a horse to water. Many subordinates couldn't follow. It really highlights the need, if you are somebody working in an organization, no matter if your job position says manager, coordinator of something, or if you are somebody who is just a case worker, but not really having any formal hierarchical position, managing others, or if you're a CEO, any of us needs both skills, following and leading, and we need to be able to switch back and forth between them depending on what our situation looks like. And that's what we call the forleading mode of management. So there's many of those different areas of practices which we call modes that managers habitually engage in. So there might be the communicating mode, there might be the strategizing mode, the localizing mode, another word that's not very common. There might be the deciding mode. And one of those modes is the forleading modes. One of the modes that we continuously in our daily working lives as managers have to switch on and off, depending on what the situation demands from us. And the idea here is that we are actually able to look at this practice, this mode of managing, of following and leading, of forleading, in that context that is our work life, our daily work life, and our larger organizational behavior. So this part down here is quite important for that reason. And the idea is that we actually engage in some type of forleading for a certain purpose. So we're going to come back to that purpose part very, very soon. And the outcome of it, so that upper part here, the yellow part, is about professionalism. And with professionalism, I mean in particular here, the idea that we as managers in an organization can assume a positive role in society and on the planet, just as firefighters, just as doctors, and so on. So the idea is that we're fulfilling a certain role. So the provision of the most important goods and services that we need for well-being in our societies, and doing so in a way that actually is ideally restorative on the planet. So this would be the ideal role that we take on. And then, of course, the purpose of managing becomes one that is somehow at least not in conflict with that basic idea of professionalism, or with a professional role, a positive role, but ideally actually a purpose that is very closely aligned with it. So this then means that we actually have to rethink many of the things that we are doing in management. So that's what I call professional forleading in this case. And there are certain aspects to it if you're thinking about it in that purpose-driven way. Certain disciplines that we can learn from, and of course there's much more than just those three, but the idea is that feeding into that purpose, we do have sustainability, environmental and social sustainability, to some degree also economic sustainability. We have responsibility, so the different stakeholders related to us as leaders and followers, and also the ethical, the moral, the normative part of it. And of course those they influence both our purpose while we are in the forleading mode, but they also influence our conduct. So there are certain things that if we are a professional, somebody who's doing things in order to gain that positive role, there are certain ways that we cannot achieve a goal, because otherwise we would violate some ethical norms. For instance, we would act unsustainably. So we might have a responsibility goal, for instance, bringing healthcare to our community might be a responsibility-led goal, community-led goal. But at the same time, we might do so in a very environmentally unsustainable way. For instance, packaging everything into plastic and that is single use and polluting, contributing to one of the biggest problems we have on the planet. So the conduct would be bad, the purpose would be good. Still, it wouldn't be professional forleading, because we are violating, while we're trying to serve and to serve a positive purpose, we're violating the conduct, the way how we get there. And forleading is particularly important, because if we think about the basic definition of leadership and followership, it's always going towards a certain goal, towards a certain purpose. And just to give you an example, so how an entire organization, or also a technology, can take part in that forleading aspect. So if you're thinking about an app like WhatsApp and the organization, the company that's behind it, and the millions and millions of people who use it, this is really a leader-follower, a forleading system. And if you think about one of the purposes of the organization, and that's being enacted to everybody in that system, this is about privacy. So all of those problems, for instance, that WhatsApp has had with certain countries where they weren't allowed to operate freely because the government wanted to have a say and access to private information. This is in a way a responsible forleading activity. And it's not only the managers in the company enacting that, it's not only the technology allowing for it to happen, and it's not only the certain governments allowing it to happen or not. So again, leading and following, the roles change there, but also it's everybody using the app at the same time. So very, very interesting case, that one. And that's really helps us to move into a more conceptual, theoretical idea of what does responsible forleading actually look like. So responsibility is always about relationships to stakeholders. So responsibility to whom? So to which stakeholder? So you've got varieties of stakeholders in that network, and then in a rather self-centered way, we're looking at ourselves in that relational network, and we're seeing how can we lead and how can we follow here. And based on that, we can take many different positive roles in that network. So we could be an effective follower. We could have identified somebody who we think actually is moving the world into a good direction, and we're following them, we're supporting what they're doing. We're not setting the direction ourselves. We are only following in that relationship. But then maybe in a different relationship, you might be an active citizen. So for instance, you might be a leader in the way that you are organizing protest. So you decide to actively unfollow certain people, certain organizations, the leadership of your company. For instance, you become an active leader out of that citizen role, so citizen of a company in this case. So it could also be citizen of a country, of course. So this is the idea that we are navigating our different roles in that stakeholder network, and our role might be different depending on which stakeholder we're relating with at that point in time. And they also might be different depending on what time and place we're in right now. So it's really that dynamic model where leading and following is a very, very intimately intertwined practice, which changes all the time. So the mode from leading and following changes so often and so seamlessly that we can really not separate them out. So following, let's try to separate them out somewhat artificially. And first of all, I would like to introduce one of the to think through this idea of folleading, which is Anna Wintour, who has been the editor-in-chief of the Vogue fashion magazine for a long time, and has many other roles as well. So she, on the one hand, here is actually talking about how important followers are in a rather uncontroversial way, but still interesting, highlighting how important followers are to a leader, because often we take this leader-centered perspective where you're saying the leader is the important person and they're going to make it happen. No, equally it is the followers making it happen. So the way how we see it here is that a follower would be a practitioner, so somebody engaging in the practice of following, and to some degree, of course, that practice of following connects to the practice of the leader themselves. But there's different types of followers, and depending on what kind of followers you have, or what kind of followers you can you are, or what kind of followers you're able to generate by your leadership activity, well, the overall network of leaders and followers moves towards the purpose, achieves it, or maybe not, or achieves something slightly different. So that's very, very much on based on those two axes. So followers might be active and passive. They might be critical and uncritical. So of course, depending on what the composition of your different followers is in those 5 different types which we have here in that network can do very different things, or it cannot do certain things. So followers are really, really crucial. And effective following, the way how it has been defined in the past, is actually a way that generates outcomes. So to commit to the common purpose, a very idealistic idea of what effective following is. But that's the idea that there is a leader or several leaders or a leading group which sets the direction, and effective following means that people following that direction, they're actually perfectly d'accord. So they are very much in line with the goal itself, and they make it happen together with the leaders. So that's what they called effective following. Or we might also have very, very extreme other follower behavior. So you could also have almost a negative type of following. And once again, I'm moving back to the Vogue here. Because one of the most controversial topics of that fashion magazine is fur in general. So we know, of course, that many of the groups that propose support animal rights and animal dignity are very, very much against fur production. They say fur is not necessary. It's cruel, even if it's produced in a supposedly responsible way, practicing it in the best way possible, it still is not necessary. It makes animals suffer unnecessarily. So one of my favorite negative following episodes is really when somewhere in the 1990s, Anna Wintour, the editor-in-chief of the Vogue, goes to her favorite New York restaurant, and just before she orders, a young woman comes in and hurls a dead raccoon on her table. On her plate, actually, and says, Anna Wintour wears fur hats. That was the statement. But very, very obviously criticizing the active support of the Vogue of fur. So there you see, once again, it's a more dynamic, a more heterogeneous composition of that leader-follower network, where some of the followers actually following by a negative motivation, trying to sabotage the overall purpose that some of the leaders of that network, in this case, the network of fashion, put out there. And it's been going on for decades now. I just saw that just 3 years ago, Anna Wintour actually was thrown a vegan cake into a show for the very same reason, once again. So it is really interesting what kind of forms leading and following actually can take. So follower activism is something that we can exemplify by those cases. Often it's not only an individual follower, it might be an entire social movement. And that movement, again, would be a different leader-follower group. Some of the followers in the group movement might be actually moving out of the kind of core ideal purpose-following activity of everybody else and become leaders once again. So it's really interesting how all of that moves back and forth, and also how different groups of leaders and followers might clash at some point in time. That kind of clash, that kind of engagement that we have between followers and leaders, or between leading and following, if you stop talking about people and start talking about the practices, you can, of course, put again into a different typology, and depending on whom you have in that network that you are part of, or in the different networks of leading and following that you're part of, those networks can or can't do different things once again. So if the level of engagement is very high and that network is entirely composed of diehards who do whatever is necessary, you might end up to be in a very radical forleading network. But also, so think about things like the Extinction Rebellion, for instance, which often practice civil disobedience, sometimes actually not going beyond that kind of, not breaking some of the principles of civil disobedience, actively actually engaging into violent acts, although violent acts against property, for instance, when in the UK, in London, some of the bank's windows were broken by followers or leaders. I don't know what they are in this case, but by people from that network that is Extinction Rebellion. Very, very interesting. Or, well, if you have it composed of isolates, where on the other end of the spectrum, well, you wouldn't get those kind of dynamics. So the idea here is, once again, managing that leading following practice network is really, really interesting and crucial for whatever we want to do as managers. So think about your group composition. If you're working in a team, for instance, think about the typical people working in your organization. Think about the people that work in your organization socialize with, but were not actually people working there. So we need to broaden the idea of what that network is from just people inside our organization or other formal groups like our working group or our department, towards a larger perspective, because those groups very, very rarely respect the kind of boundaries that we are trying to impose onto them. So it's really interesting to think about, what group am I actually part of and who is in that group? Good. Let's talk about leading a little bit more. So the other part, the other side of the coin. So leaders are typically, first of all, I actually think leading is very, very much overemphasized in our world nowadays. If there were only leaders and no followers, nothing would ever get done. We would have a completely fragmented system of activities and of purposes, where everybody has their own thing and nobody's doing something together with somebody else, unless just coincidentally the interests align and you both get something out of it for your own very individual agenda. So how do we actually understand leadership or leading as a practice better? So one of the big theories and really helpful frameworks in that context is situational leadership, that there is not one right leadership style, because for a long time the discussion was about what's the best leadership style. Well, and then situational leadership came out and said, well, there is not one right leadership style, because depending on the time and place and people and technologies and everything else that belongs to a situation, one leadership style will always be better than another. One practice of leading will always be better than another. And once again, I think it makes more sense to talk about practices or different modes of leading than talking about leaders who have a certain style, because we can build a certain repertoire of different modes of leading as a person. I do not always have to be a Machiavellian leader who does everything, tries to fulfill the goal at all costs and shies away of no whatever mean measures. I do not always have to be a participatory leader who always asks everybody for their opinion and goes by the majority decision. I can, and you can, everybody can learn to actually move up and down and move to different positions in that repertoire, changing our practices depending on what the situation is. And here we do have a couple of examples, and there's just a few of what aspects of that situation we might want to consider when we're changing up and down, back and forth in that repertoire. And so one of those main characteristics is the level to which our followers, if we are in the leading role at the moment, if we're engaging in practice of leading. So what's the level of development of our followers? So very, very interesting as one aspect to think about, where do my followers stand? So once again, it's so important, even if we are in that leading practice mode, it's really crucial to know what's going on the follower side and the following practices of others. So how competent around me engaging in the practice of following that are required for my particular goal. And of course, that goes much further than we just think between extreme points of following. So one being very passive and ineffective, and the other one very active and effective. There's a whole range of different characterizations in between. So this is really the type of repertoire I was talking about. So depending on where you are, some of the leadership practices described here might be more suitable than other ones. So have a close look at these. And beyond that, you can actually think about completely different, not only on the same range, on the same scale, but from different areas. So you might have humanistic leadership, for instance, who is leading for the human well-being of people. You might have Machiavellian leadership, who's controlling others, instrumentalizing people in order to get to their goals. You might have authentic leadership, which is all centered on building honest relationships that reflect your true self, who you are. So you're leading naturally, if you want. So you could have spiritual leadership, where there's some kind of, and you don't need to be a cult leader to enact spiritual leadership, but there might be some kind of spiritual component to it. And often we actually see that there's a certain kind of almost like an aura, some kind of almost spiritual dimension to many leaders. They're believed to be able to almost supernatural things happen. People believe in them. So spiritual leadership often is a part of many leadership relationships. So once again, I think it's a good representation of that repertoire that you can go through and that can help you in order to see what kind of leadership, what kind of leading practices should I engage in right now? What's the best thing I can do here? And that's really one of the core managerial skills, knowing which one to pick, assessing the situation, and knowing which one is the one that brings me where I want to be. So just to highlight one more, most of those leadership frameworks that I mentioned there come from a Western white background. So Machiavellian leadership, obviously, the Italian roots, many of the theoretical frameworks about leadership coming from the US, because this is where much of the research used to go on. But the important thing is here, we're living in a global world. We're living in a world that is that has so much to offer, so much difference locally. And many times we can actually learn from those local differences and elevate them to become something global that's globally relevant. And the other part of that is really the movement of what we call decolonialization, to say, well, they're not only the explicit colonial activities from the past, where somebody from one country subdues another country and makes it theirs, colonializing this country, but also there's many other types of colonialism going on, and one of them being colonialism in the sense that Western concepts, like the ones we just looked at, are being imposed as the right concept or the only alternatives to places that might have awesome other leadership frameworks to offer. So thinking about Australia, where you are, think about indigenous ways of living, but also ways of leading. Maybe those are much, much more suitable to what you want to do. And maybe they're even an alternative to what we see globally and could be much, much more effective depending on the situation than some of the ones that were on the last slide. Good. So once again, just an example for how we could have very kind of intersectionally good, diverse leadership. So Julian Adieri Omala here from Uganda, who's also known as Mama Cheers. Mama Cheers is the brand of juices that she has become famous for, and she has built her empire around. So she brings together a very typical Ugandan leadership style. Look her up. It's really outstandingly interesting how she roots leadership in her origin. She is a woman leader. She's a Black leader at the same time in a male-dominated environment. So very interesting. And actually, that unique aspect partly also translates over into her charismatic leadership that she's often being hailed for. So it's very interesting how those social, environmental, ethical topics often also translate into leadership effectiveness. And also the other part is that depending on where you are, we keep talking about situational leadership, there are certain dominant modes of leading, which are important because then you can not only adjust your style of following to it, but also you can think about how acceptable or institutionalized your style of leading is, which once again is an important part of the situation itself. Good. So before I go through those principles, very important, I actually left out about 1/3 of the chapter because I didn't want to make this too long and too onerous, which is about the organizational behavior aspects of it. So it's about things like power in organizations, motivation in organizations, but also things like group and team behavior and so on. So all of those organizational behavior, very psychology heavy subjects I didn't talk about right now. I want to do that in another video at some other point in time, because Valerie, who leads your class, she was very keen on that forleading aspect, which we focused on here. So summary, professional forleading in a way that is on the one hand fulfilling a positive role for in society and on the planet, but also part of that role is not only the purpose, sustainable, responsible, ethical, but also sustainable, responsible, and ethical conduct. We need both of them in order to engage in professional forleading. Responsible forleading is then working in that network of stakeholders, and each and every one of those stakeholders could be a leader or a follower at any point in time, change between leading and following practices. And then effective followers are the ones which actually in the most effective way lead a following group or a follower towards a certain goal in that network of leaders and followers. But again, take that with a grain of salt. The effective followers are not the best followers, because it really depends on the goal that you're pursuing. Could be a really bad. And that's why also those other types of followers are so extremely important, because we might need followers that actively sabotage a network in order to avoid them from reaching that particular goal. Think about the petrol fuel lobby, for instance, or more broadly, the carbon-based industries, which I understand are very, very big in Australia. So maybe you want to become a follower that actively is subversive, maybe move some of the companies in those industries into a different direction, actively sabotaging what's going on. So that's an open call for sabotage here. Welcome to my world. So that's the idea. And maybe even you might be engaging in follower activism from the inside or from the outside. Maybe you're working for an NGO going against it, or maybe you're in a governmental organization. Or it could even be an entire social movement, or just an isolated case of opposition where you're saying, okay, I'm working here, but I'm not going to do that. I'm standing here, I'm not moving. So then, of course, the idea is that situational leadership is extremely important, that we are able to, and we should actually broaden that and say situational leadership and followership. It's not only about leading, changing your leading practices based on the situation. It's also, of course, about changing your following practice. So all of those different roles of followers we talked about before, see them rather as different practices of following that you could pick and choose, that could become of your repertoire of forleading, of different leading practices and following practices, depending on what your situation looks like. Good. Overall, we're done. Thank you very much for having me once again. And I'm very much looking forward to the in-class discussion, which we're going to have. And understand you will have seen that video before to prime that discussion. So looking forward to it. It's going to be very, very lively and very enjoyable, I think. Thanks a lot, everybody.